I know it's there. I've got to believe it because I see the reactions, I see the photographs, I see the critics and people who recognize me in the street.
She was the most elegant woman in Hollywood. 2 husbands, a string of heartbreaks, and a life that looked like a fairy tale from the outside. But in her final months, Audrey Hepburn did something almost no one expected. She quietly and deliberately named the one man she never truly got over. Not one of her husbands, not a co-star, someone most people wouldn't guess. And when you find out who it was and why, the entire story of her life starts to look completely different. The marriage that slowly broke her. Most people remember Audrey Hepburn for the black dress, the pearls, the effortless grace. What they remember less is that for 14 years, she was married to a man who made her feel small. His name was Mel Ferrer. On the surface, they looked like a perfect match. Both cultured, both multilingual, both deeply invested in the arts. They met through Gregory Peck in the early 1950s, and when they were cast together in Undine, whatever spark existed off-stage became impossible to ignore. By September 1954, they were married in a quiet ceremony in Switzerland. For a while, the partnership worked. Ferrer took an active role in shaping her career, and Audrey, still finding her footing in Hollywood, welcomed the guidance. But there's a fine line between support and control, and over time, that line disappeared entirely. People close to the couple began to notice the shift. Ferrer had opinions about everything, which roles she should take, how she should present herself publicly, who she should spend time with. What had started as a creative alliance slowly became something more suffocating. Audrey was one of the most famous women in the world, yet inside that marriage, she often deferred entirely to him. And then there was the question of children. More than almost anything else in her life, Audrey wanted to be a mother. It wasn't a casual desire. It was something she carried with a deep, almost aching urgency. In 1955, she became pregnant for the first time and miscarried. The loss was devastating. Then in 1959, she was pregnant again while filming The Unforgiven. During a scene that required her to ride a horse, she was thrown. The fall broke her back. Weeks in hospital followed. And then another miscarriage. The grief of those losses, layered on top of a marriage that was quietly closing in on her, took a visible toll. In 1960, she finally gave birth to her first son, Sean. And for a brief moment, it felt like things might stabilize. She stepped back from acting for a full year, something almost unheard of for someone at her level of fame, and devoted herself entirely to motherhood. But the marriage kept eroding. The whispers that had surrounded them for years grew louder. Rumors of Ferrer's temper, his jealousy, and eventually infidelity on both sides. After 14 years, it ended. Audrey walked away emotionally drained, but also, for the first time in years, free. What she didn't know was that the next relationship would hurt her in an entirely different way. The man she chose over Hollywood. By the late 1960s, Audrey Hepburn was at the absolute peak of her fame. Breakfast at Tiffany's. Charade. My Fair Lady. She had become something beyond a film star. She was a cultural institution. And then, without warning, she walked away from all of it. The decision confused Hollywood. Studios were offering her almost anything she wanted. Directors wanted her. Audiences adored her. But Audrey had made up her mind, and the reason was not complicated. She wanted to give her son Sean the childhood she never had. Fame, in her view, was starting to cost him something she wasn't willing to let go. It was around this time, during a summer cruise in the Mediterranean, that she met Andrea Ditti. He was an Italian psychiatrist, charming, warm, socially fluent in a way that felt like a relief after the rigidity of her first marriage. The setting was almost unfairly romantic. Historic coastlines, open water, long evenings with nothing to interrupt them. Within 6 months, they were married. Audrey moved to Rome. She leaned into the idea of a quieter life, wife, mother, private person. For a while, it looked like exactly what she had described wanting. But Ditti had a version of himself he had kept carefully hidden during those Mediterranean evenings. The affairs started early and didn't stop. They weren't discreet either. Reports of his extramarital relationships became a regular feature of the Italian press. The paparazzi, who had followed Audrey relentlessly even in Rome, made sure none of it stayed private. She had left Hollywood to escape the intrusion of public life, only to find herself living inside a very different kind of spectacle. She stayed longer than most people expected her to, partly for their son Luca, born in 1970, and partly because she was not someone who gave up easily on commitments. But the combination of Diddy's repeated betrayals and the impossibility of any real privacy eventually made the situation untenable. When the marriage finally ended, Audrey didn't talk about it at length publicly. That wasn't her style. But those close to her described the divorce as something that left her more guarded than she had ever been before. 2 marriages, 2 very different kinds of disappointment, and underneath both of them, a pattern that stretched back much further than either relationship. What the men in her life all had in common. Here's something that gets overlooked in almost every account of Audrey Hepburn's love life. The relationships she chose and the pain she accepted within them didn't start with Mel Ferrer or Andrea Diddy. They started when she was a child. Audrey was born in Brussels in 1929. Her early years were transient. Her family moved regularly between London, Arnhem, and elsewhere, following her father Joseph Rustin's work. By the time she was still quite young, she spoke 6 languages. From the outside, it looked like a privileged, cosmopolitan upbringing. What was happening underneath was something else entirely. Both of her parents had been open supporters of the Nazi regime in the 1930s, not quietly, but actively. They traveled to Germany, attended rallies, and aligned themselves publicly with its ideology. Then, in 1935, her father left. He became so absorbed in fascist politics that he walked out on Audrey and her mother entirely and relocated to London. She was 6 years old. That abandonment became the defining emotional wound of her life. She would say so herself years later. When she was sent to boarding school in Kent, she watched other children go home during holidays. She waited. Her father had visitation rights and never used them. He simply didn't come. Then the war began, and Audrey was sent to the Netherlands believing it would be safer. It wasn't. In 1940, German forces invaded. She was 10 years old, living under occupation, hiding in cellars while gunfire moved through the streets above her. She adopted a Dutch name, Etta van Heemstra, to avoid being identified as English. In 1942, 2 of her uncles were arrested and executed by the Nazis. After that, she stopped trying to stay invisible. She joined the Dutch resistance, carrying messages and underground newspapers, sometimes concealing them in her shoes. She also danced. Before the war, ballet had been her entire dream. Now she used it differently, performing at secret fundraisers for the resistance, in rooms where no one could applaud, because a single sound might give them all away. By 1944, famine had swept through the Netherlands during one of the coldest winters on record. German blockades had cut off food supplies. Audrey's family ate tulip bulbs. Her health deteriorated, malnutrition, anemia, respiratory illness. The girl who would later become one of the most photographed women of the 20th century was, at that moment, a starving teenager. When liberation finally came, a UNICEF worker gave her a chocolate bar. She never forgot it. Psychologists who have studied her life in depth have pointed to her father's abandonment as the lens through which almost everything else needs to be understood. The men she was drawn to tended to be older, authoritative, and in control. Ferrer fit that profile exactly. So, in a different way, did Diddy. She wasn't naive. She was, in many ways, unconsciously searching for the stability her father had taken with him when he left. And what made it more complicated was that she eventually found him. In the 1960s, using the Red Cross, she tracked down Joseph Rustin. He had been living in Dublin since 1939, the same year he had driven her to the airport and sent her away. She approached the reunion, hoping for something. Warmth, perhaps. Acknowledgement. Some form of repair. What she found was a man who offered almost nothing in return. He was distant, indifferent. The reconciliation she had carried in her imagination for decades simply didn't happen. She forgave him.